So welcome everyone. My name is Drew. I am the Clean Energy Program Director with Massachusetts Climate Action Network. Excited to have you all on tonight. We do have a large crowd, so welcome on this June evening to talk about net zero buildings. I think you're all going to really enjoy our speakers and learn a lot from them. Joining us tonight will be Meredith Elbaum, the Executive Director of USGBC, Ben Silverman from the City of Boston, Larry Yu, who is a MCAN Buildings Co-Leader and also a member of the Climate Coalition of Somerville, and Rebecca Wintrick-Knox, who is the Clean Energy Organizing Fellow with MCAN. A couple of logistics, like I've said, I have muted everyone, or also if you're not speaking, please make sure that you are on mute. If you are having problems with the audio, I recommend calling in and having the image on your laptop or your tablet, but listening via the phone. As a reminder, we will be doing a moderated Q&A at the end, so you can take advantage of the chat window to type in questions there. Please only use that to type in questions. Please do not answer questions during the webinar amongst yourselves, as that can get distracting for folks. We will get to all the questions at the end, but we will have a hard cutoff at 8 o'clock, so we will get through as many as we can. And as I mentioned, we are recording this webinar, and we'll put it onto our YouTube channel and our website under the Past Webinars tab. We will send you a link of the webinar as well, so you can share that with folks in your community or your network if you found this helpful. And I'm sure all of you will find this very helpful. So let's go ahead and get started. As I mentioned, I am Drew, the Clean Energy Program Director with MCAN. MCAN was founded in the year 2000 by a couple of gentlemen working together in their local communities to take on climate issues, and found that it was helpful when they shared ideas with each other, and beyond that kind of realized, hey, there must be other folks out there in other towns in Massachusetts also doing the same thing, and that's how MCAN was born. This idea of sharing expertise and knowledge with each other to help overcome obstacles and achieve goals. Today we've grown from those 2 chapters to more than 50 chapters across the state that represent more than 90 different communities. We advocate both at the town and city level in order to bring about community level change and turn the state, and that works on both the state and national level as well to bring that change about. You know, it used to be that we talked about the future of climate change and what it's going to look like in Massachusetts, and right now we're talking about how the climate's already changing, from tornadoes that we've seen in Massachusetts the last few years, beach erosion in Cape Cod, and then also this flood or drought situation that we seem to find ourselves in every few years in different parts of the state, where we'll have flooding out on the coast and then oftentimes drought conditions in different areas of the state. On the national level, what we've seen is not a lot of good news the past couple of years. With this new administration, definitely looking at climate change as something that's not real and can be avoided if we just turn our back on it and look at profit margins instead. And also putting into critical leadership positions people that are carrying out that mission of his as well. But fortunately, back on the local level, groups like MCAN, USGBC, and other leaders are taking action to bring about that change here in Massachusetts and starting to build up the leadership that we're going to need once we're ready for action to take place again on the national level. We are seeing a lot of momentum happening here in Massachusetts and throughout the region as well. And we have the solutions and the answers to a lot of what's going to be happening and happening here on the local level. We're going to be getting ready to roll those out here soon. So the first person I'd like to introduce to everyone is Meredith Elbaum, who is the Executive Director of USGBC. And Meredith, if you are ready to go, we are excited to hear from you now.
I'm ready to go. And I guess I'm just going to tell you when to turn the slide, right?
Absolutely.
Okay, so next slide. So U.S. Green Building Council of Massachusetts, our organization drives sustainable and regenerative design, construction, and operations of the built environment. That's who we are. We're based in Massachusetts. Go next. And I was asked today to talk about zero energy buildings. And this is the New Buildings Institute it has been studying and looking at zero energy buildings, and it's clear from this hockey stick chart that there are more and more zero energy buildings coming online every year. You can go to the next one. And these are across all different types of buildings, whether it's private, public, federal, multifamily, et cetera. But we're seeing the trend across all building types. Of course, the highest is private for-profit. Next. So you hear in the industry us talk about a lot of different terms: net zero energy, zero net energy, zero energy. These are all the same terms. You might hear us talk about zero carbon, and that's slightly different. We can talk about zero net zero cost. There's a lot of different terms going around. If you go to the next slide. And this is one that Jacob Knowles at BR+A put together, looking at the zero net energy classifications used by NREL, and that there are different ways to talk about zero net energy. One is Class A, which means that your building is going to use the energy, it's going to create as much energy as it uses within the building footprint. Class B would be that it would create as much energy as it uses on site. The next, and then Class C and Class D, and onward with Class D, saying that you can actually purchase off-site renewable energy to offset the renewable energy on your site. So different ways and different classifications, and it's important when you go through and talk about ZNE that you are clear on that everyone is speaking the same language. If you can go on. And there are some organizations that are out there. This is one that the International Living Future Institute, for instance, has different zero net energy certifications, starting with zero carbon certification, going up to zero energy certification, and then progressing all the way up to looking at the entire building across different aspects besides just energy and carbon for their Living Building Challenge certification. There are others. LEED now has their zero certification, which looks at both energy, transportation, and waste, and I believe also water. And so looking at different certifications to really, instead of just saying this is what we're doing, that you can actually certify your projects now. Next. Can you go on to the next? So about almost a year ago, USGBC, in collaboration with MCAN and MAPC and NEEP and a couple others, put together a municipal roundtable event focused on zero net energy. You can go next. And we had a number of different communities represented. This is not an exhaustive list of all of the activities that are happening in Massachusetts, but there's a lot of different activities happening, and this is what was outlined at that and represented at our summit. Next slide, please. And at that summit, you can see here that the number one barrier to zero net energy that this group came up with was upfront costs. They said the number one barrier to zero net energy buildings was upfront costs. You can go to the next slide. And they said that changes, the most popular big ideas to overcome some of these were code changes, and then the next runner-up was financial incentives. You can go on. So based on that, and then in addition to that, there are a whole bunch of studies that have already been completed around the United States on the cost of zero net energy buildings. You can go on. But we wanted to look at what you could do here in Massachusetts. And so we actually have a report that's coming out looking at the cost of zero energy buildings in Massachusetts, and it's called Saving Money from the Start. This has not been released yet, but this is a little bit of a preview. It should be coming out really in the next couple of weeks. You can go on. And just a little definition, when we talk about zero energy buildings, we talk about the energy use intensity, how much energy that building is going to use per square foot and all the things that go into using a building, so the lighting, the pumps, the equipment, et cetera, divided by the gross building area. So every building that we have has an energy use intensity, and we start under it, and this is a way that we can start comparing buildings from one to another. Go on. And so when we're talking about zero energy, the way that we get to zero energy is we take a typical building, and let's say a typical building has an energy use intensity you can see here of 27. And what we would do to that energy use to that typical building is we would try to drive the energy loads down as far as possible through energy conservation measures, like having a better envelope, like having more efficient air conditioning and heating systems, better lighting, et cetera. And through doing that, we can actually drive the energy loads for that building down pretty significantly. So if we start with an energy use intensity of 27, we can relatively easily get to a zero energy ready building, is what we're calling it, with an energy use intensity of 13 pretty easily, using standard energy conservation measures that are available today. And so we're cutting our energy use from 27 to 13. And then in order to make it a zero energy building, we either need to put renewable energy on site or a combination of on-site renewable energy and off-site renewable energy. So you can go on to the next one. For our study, we looked at 6 different building types. We ran energy models for those building types to identify how low we could drive the energy use with energy conservation measures. And then we looked at, and then that gave us how much renewables we would need to either be able to have on-site and or on and off-site. Next. And then we ran life cycle cost assessments looking at the cost of a typical building, the additional money it would take to get to a zero energy building, how much money then it would take to have renewables. We subtracted all of the incentives that are available and the savings that you would have, and for each of these buildings have a break-even year. So next slide. And so this is an example of one of the buildings that we looked at where we were able to drive the energy load down significantly, over 50%. This would be going to a full electric building, and then looking at that you would then make up the remaining of that with some on-site PV, and then the rest would need to be purchased. You can go next. And this particular building type had a 6-year break-even point. You can go on. And the point to all of this is that we actually have a lot of examples of these projects in Massachusetts right now that are operating. The King Open, including from schools to science centers, multi-family residential, lots of different building types, and lots of examples of buildings that are doing zero energy buildings with little upfront costs and long-term savings. Can you go to the next one? And this is just one of those examples. This is Bristol Community College, the SBREGA building designed by Sasaki and the engineers for BR+A. You can go on. This is a drawing they did going from high performance, and then they actually did a redesign of this building to get it to be zero net energy and simplified the systems for this building. And in doing so, if you can go on, they're able to save money that balanced out their costs. And so in the end, this project, if you go to the next slide, ended up not costing more, and then with financing that they had and with all the available incentives, they ended up saving money on this project. And the project this is relatively recent data, that it's actually outperforming the projected targets. And so you have an example of a building that it didn't cost more money for the project team. They were able to redesign with different systems to get from a high-performing building to a zero-energy building, and they have solar on site and are able to get to it's a zero net energy building. And as I said, if you go on to the next slide, we have more examples of these projects and different building types that we looked at, and more examples of projects in Massachusetts that are being built today with very low, if not any, added upfront costs to get to zero energy buildings.
Thank you, Meredith. Appreciate you jumping in with us tonight. And I do encourage, if anyone does have questions for Meredith, please put those into the chat window. We will be getting to those at the end of tonight's webinar. Next up, I'd like to introduce Benjamin Silverman from the City of Boston in their Environment Division. And Ben, if you are ready to go, we are ready for you.
Fantastic. So thank you, and hello again. My name is Ben Silverman. I'm with the City of Boston's Environment Department, where I primarily work on existing buildings and zoning for new construction, energy efficiency, and all that good stuff. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about the importance of net zero buildings for Boston's climate mitigation goals and some of the early analysis and preliminary planning that we're starting to do on that particular front. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah. So just that. Oh, yeah. So the starting point is that Mayor Martin Walsh, along with the mayors of 14 other communities in the metro area, have committed Boston to be carbon neutral by 2050. This builds off of our current already existing goals of 20% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 and 50% reduction by 2030. This is all recognizing the severity of climate change and the risk it poses, especially to coastal cities like Boston, that really cannot be understated. And this goal is the city's recognition of both of the importance of that, as well as our responsibility to, the globe, to meet the challenge head on, to do our part. Next slide. To meet this goal, we must first recognize that depending on the year, between 70 and 75% of Boston's annual greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings. This is by far the most important sector for us to be working on in order to lower our emissions and meet our 2050 goals. Next slide. The pie chart here is based off of the Boston's 2016 citywide greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and it does help to illustrate this issue. Just as a side note, the 2017 citywide greenhouse gas inventory should be out sometime next month, and it takes about 2 years to get all the data needed to put this together. Anyway, so while transportation emissions are not insignificant, you can see that the bulk of our emissions come from buildings, and especially with that darker gray area, larger ones. So those are the high-rise commercials, buildings in downtown, the hospitals, the laboratories, the universities, the various high-rise residential. That's over 50% of our citywide emissions. Next slide. And the reason for this can be summarized in one word: heating. Boston, like many other northern cities, requires huge quantities of fossil fuels to continuously heat our homes and workplaces during the winter months. The orange, reddish, the yellow, and the green sections of the bar graph we see here, and this is our GHG greenhouse gas inventory over the last decade and change, are just heating. That's the natural gas, the fuel oil, and the steam that goes into the heating of buildings in the city. And it's about 50%, depending on the year, of our citywide emissions. Next slide. So the question is, what do we do with that information? How do we move on and start acting in that particular area? The Carbon-Free Boston report, which was recently released, was prepared by the Boston University Institute for Sustainable Energy. Its goal was to look at what strategies were needed at a high level for Boston to meet its 2050 carbon neutrality goals. So at that high level, the BU team saw three main interconnected sort of themes for these strategies that should be pursued simultaneously across all sectors. First is efficiency. In all sectors, we must lower energy demand as much as possible. For buildings, this means better insulation, more efficient equipment, and more efficient overall operations. Secondly is electrification. All energy usage has to come from electricity consumption, and direct fossil fuel consumption needs to be phased out. So natural gas, oil, all that stuff. And for buildings, this means moving towards heating equipment such as air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps that rely on electricity. And then lastly, renewables, that all that electricity has to be coming from renewable sources, whether on or off-site for the building. So these are the overarching strategies that Meredith went into far greater detail on of how you get to meeting these goals for buildings and essentially getting to net zero building. Next slide. According to BU, a key area for this is to ensure that all new buildings construction is being done at a net zero carbon standard that meets those sort of three overarching themes. As folks know, that we're in the middle of a pretty big building boom here in Boston, and each new building built is a new emission source. So the sooner we act to ensure these buildings are built to a net zero standard, the better it is for both Boston and the overall environment. The graph here just shows two different scenarios of depending on when a new net zero building standard comes into effect between 2023 and 2030, and just shows the cumulative emissions on an annual basis that would come from those two scenarios. Next slide. As I think we'll go into a little bit more detail later, and maybe some of you know, the City of Boston, as well as all municipalities in Massachusetts, does not have authority to change or adopt its own building code. That is determined by the state by a body called the Board of Building Regulations and Standards, or BBRS. And I think we're going to go into a little bit more detail in the next section. So recognizing this, and the need to move quickly towards a net zero building standard, the mayors of Boston, the city manager of Cambridge, and the mayor of Somerville came together and signed a joint letter to the BBRS urging them to adopt a net zero standard. And as you'll hear more, this has begun to move forward, as the BBRS has since moved to look into what adopting a net zero standard will look like, and we're very excited and look forward to see how this collaboration will move forward. Next slide. But new construction isn't everything. BU analyzed Boston's current building stock of predominantly older buildings combined with the current projections of construction growth over the next 30 years, and found that in 2050, assuming business as usual, no big environmental reduction changes has taken place, it's estimated that as much as 93% of our buildings' emissions will still come from those buildings that exist today. And Boston has a very large, very old, in many cases, and in some cases not well insulated building stock of more than 80,000 freestanding structures. The vast majority will likely need to make some form of efficiency retrofitting in the coming years if we are to meet that 2050 goal. Next slide. It is all to say that requiring net zero new construction is incredibly important for Boston's strategies of meeting our 2050 carbon neutral goal. But retrofitting the currently existing building stock is really where a lot of the most important work is going to be taking place over the coming years. Next slide. The BU study found that through a combination of deep energy efficiency retrofits, electrification of building heating systems, and a transition to a 100% renewable electricity grid, we can achieve a net zero carbon standard for the bulk of Boston's existing buildings. Though, if you see at the far end, the residual emissions, there is areas for more innovation as we kind of take on some of the harder to reach emissions reduction sources, especially around hospitals, manufacturing, and laboratories, which have a lot of high intensity energy demand needs. But that's one of the many pieces of the puzzle that we're going to have to be looking at over the next 30 years. Last slide. Next slide. So right now at the City of Boston, we're working to update our climate action plan using the BU Carbon Free Boston findings to inform our analysis and working with a lot of stakeholders and people in the community to develop out some ideas of how to put these into actions. And I believe many folks possibly on this call and with MCAN have been involved in that. We're still a little ways away from all that being finalized, with a lot more meetings and analysis to go through, but there's been a lot of productive talk on strategies for net zero retrofits for existing buildings. I just wanted to end with two case examples of programs and policies that we're seeing outside of Boston that have come up in discussions around the Climate Action Plan, and kind of give an idea of what some of the possibilities will look like. We're not necessarily saying we're going to adopt similar things. Some of these things we might not be able to, but it gives an idea of what's theoretically possible. The first is Energy Sprung. It literally means energy leap, from the Netherlands. This is a program that relies on innovations in the prefabricated building component space to basically manufacture on a mass scale exterior insulation cladding for existing small-rise residential buildings. It's a lot of words, but basically in so many words it means that you're putting a giant warm coat over little homes to make them far more efficient, better insulation, better envelope. And that picture in the middle kind of showcases, the one on the right is an Energy Sprung retrofit, the other one on the left is not. So it's just adding more thickness and layers to the building insulation. So thanks to these innovations, plus a pretty robust financing mechanism that uses energy cost savings to pay for the improvements, they've gotten to the point of turning around net zero retrofit projects in under 10 days, which is pretty impressive. That said, there are limitations to this model. It's really best for more squarer buildings, smaller residential, but it's something to keep an eye on. The second, and many of you may have heard of this, has been the recent passage of the New York City Climate Mobilization Act. This act sets basically a max emission target for each building type, multifamily, schools, theaters, hospitals, above 25,000 square feet, et cetera, that the building must meet or outperform annually starting 2024. If they exceed that, that is, if they emit more than their required target, they have to pay a pretty sizable fee per metric ton of CO2 that they release. And these targets are designed to ratchet up in 2023 and moving forward. Next slide. And yeah, so, the question we want to shoot back to you all is, what do you think else we can be looking at? What else can be done on existing buildings? And also, it's not all on the city. What can, how can community groups, the private sector, and, other stakeholders help make your home, schools, and workplace net zero? Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Appreciate your time here with us tonight, and we are ready to move on to our next speaker. Before I do that, though, I do encourage anyone with questions to take advantage of the chat window. We will work our way through those at the end of the webinar tonight. But next up, I would like to introduce Rebecca Wintrick-Knox, who is the Clean Energy Organizing Fellow with MCAN. So, Rebecca, all yours.
Hello, Drew. I'm hearing a little bit of background noise, so if you are unmuted, if you could go ahead and mute yourself, that would be super helpful. Thanks. So I'm going to be talking tonight about our Net Zero Stretch Code campaign. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight, and thank you as well to Ben and Meredith for filling us in on why net zero buildings are a crucial part of the climate solution. So I'm going to be talking about the work that we're doing on our Better Buildings campaign and focus particularly on our push for a net zero stretch code. So here we have the question, why do we need a net zero stretch code? Next slide. So the answer is pretty simple. As we have just seen in Ben's presentation in a lot of detail, buildings contribute to climate change in a major way. So in order to meet our community's climate goals as well as the climate goals of our Commonwealth, we need to start making sure that all new buildings are being built to the most efficient standard possible. Net zero building codes have already been implemented in DC and in California, and there are lots of great examples out there of net zero and zero energy codes that could form the basis for a similar code in Massachusetts. Next slide. So very quickly, I'm just going to go over how building codes work in Massachusetts. So I know Ben started this conversation, but I thought I would clarify for any folks who are unfamiliar with the process that unlike in most states, in Massachusetts, we only have 2 building codes, the base code and the stretch code. The base code is our metaphorical floor for new construction, and the stretch code is our metaphorical ceiling. And both of these codes are implemented by the BBRS, the Board of Building Regulations and Standards, which is a body of about 10 people, ranging from code officials to building inspectors, that is appointed by the governor. And all towns and cities in the Commonwealth have to adhere to these codes. Next slide. So how do we change our building codes? Tonight we're going to be really focusing on our net zero stretch code work, but I also wanted to briefly touch on the work that MCAN, as well as many of our partners, and I'm sure a lot of the advocates on this webinar have been doing over the past year to strengthen our base code. So we've been doing this by recruiting pro-efficiency municipal officials to register to vote on the new version of the International Energy Conservation Code this coming November, which will ultimately become the new base code in Massachusetts. And we're really excited about this effort, and I encourage any of you who are interested in learning more or want to take action but haven't already to reach out to me to get involved with this campaign. And then the second big piece of this work is the push for a net zero stretch code. So when the stretch code was adopted about 10 years ago, it was because communities were asking to be able to build to a more efficient standard than the base code was allowing them. And 10 years ago, when it was first developed, the stretch code was a substantial improvement over the base code. However, over the past several code cycles, the base code has increased in terms of efficiency, while the stretch code has plateaued, meaning that it's really no longer a significant leap forward for efficiency. So our campaign is focused on making our stretch code an actual stretch again by updating it to a net zero standard. Next slide. And basically, the bottom line is that in order to require net zero planning, we do need a net zero stretch code. Although some communities like Cambridge have used zoning to go above our current stretch code, the BBRS is not super amenable to giving out these exceptions and wants all Massachusetts towns and cities to be code compliant. So by developing and enforcing this net zero stretch code and by making it an option for our communities, these communities that have been trying to do net zero buildings for years will be able to actually get this work done more effectively. Next slide. Okay, so this is just a map showing which communities have adopted the current stretch code, which is, as you can see, very much of the state. And something else important to note is that in order to become a green community, you must pass the stretch code. Next slide. So what have we been up to get this work done? So we partnered with 2 new climate champions in the State House this session, Joe Comerford and Tammy Gouveia, to file an act to establish a net zero stretch energy code. And this is a pretty simple bill. It essentially directs the BBRS to develop a net zero carbon code to be fully implemented by 2030. And we want the communities that were the first to adopt the first stretch code and are ready to do net zero planning now to be the first to pass the new stretch code, meaning there will be a phase-in period for other green communities. And we also want to make sure that we're amplifying the voices of environmental justice communities, so folks that are paying the biggest slice of their incomes and utility bills, to make sure that our transition to net zero is an equitable one. Next slide. So now I want to just highlight a recent victory that Ben touched on, which is that by teaming up with partner organizations and advocates across the state, as well as legislators and our climate champion municipal officials, we were able to really pack the last BBRS public comment hearing with folks that were testifying in favor of a net zero code. And just last week, we got this really exciting piece of news, which is that the BBRS decided at their June meeting to get to work on a net zero code. So this is a really big step in the right direction and absolutely could not have happened without the grassroots work of advocates like you all, but we definitely don't want to lose the momentum that we've been building. And we know that some of the BBRS is not super excited about the idea of a net zero code. We want to make sure that we're continuing this fight to make sure that the next stretch code, the net zero code, is the most robust and efficient code possible, and also that it happens as quickly as possible. Next slide. So here are some next steps that you can take to join our Net Zero Stretch Code campaign. So tomorrow you'll be getting an email from me with more details and more materials about these next steps. But some action items include attending the upcoming hearing on our legislation, which we still have to confirm the date for, but will likely be in the next couple of weeks. Reaching out to your local climate champions to have them send letters to the BBRS, CCing the governor and Speaker DeLeo, explaining why a net zero code is really important to your community's climate goals, as well as calling your legislators to have them attend the briefing on the bill on June 26th. And we're really excited about continuing this effort, and then we know that with the help of advocates like you, we will see a net zero building code adopted in Massachusetts in the near future. So now I'm going to turn it over to Larry Yu.
Hi, thanks everyone. My name's Larry Yu. I'm from the Climate Coalition of Somerville, and I don't really have a presentation, so you're going to be staring at this slide for a while. I feel a little inadequate following Meredith and Ben and Rebecca and their slides, but I guess I'll just walk through a timeline of some of the things we've done, and hopefully a few of those steps will resonate with you. What you're looking at here is Somerville's first net zero house built back in 2012. Unfortunately, it might still be Somerville's only net zero house here in 2019. Meredith might correct me. She probably has better data than me, but the bottom line really is that we still have a long way to go. So first, some quick background. Buildings are 59% of emissions in Somerville, so a little bit less than Boston, but more than the state as a whole. Most of Somerville is built out. It's the densest city in New England. With that said, there are, I don't know, maybe 3 more neighborhoods that will be redeveloped probably in the next decade. And after that, the city's building emissions are pretty much going to be locked in. So we have a small window of opportunity to make a big difference on new construction. Somerville also has a carbon neutral by 2050 goal. And the city launched its climate action plan last November with 13 different action areas. And I mention that because 2 of them are relevant here. One of those action areas is to explore the feasibility of a local net zero performance standard for new development, of course, which is really the topic of discussion here. But another one is to advocate at the state level for building an energy code that achieve net zero energy performance. And I think that's that's underappreciated as an action item, because that was a useful entry point for our advocacy to the city, because we could ask the city to do things to advocate on the state level, because we could point to this action item in the climate action plan. So the groundwork for our coalition's work on this really began when we got involved with the city's zoning code revamp about a year and a half ago, early in 2018. Sorry, I'm picking up a lot of background noise. Can everyone hear me okay? Hopefully. Well, I'll just keep going, and hopefully you'll pick up enough of what I'm saying. So the city's been trying to redo its zoning code for quite some time, and we got involved because we thought it was a good opportunity to transform, the building sector in this short window of opportunity. But the first thing we had to do is go back and sort of educate ourselves. We are, a bunch of activists. We don't know a ton about buildings. There are no activists no architects among our core group, but there were some that we were acquainted with. So we had a Somerville architect with Tacit House expertise present to us, so we could, I guess, better understand building methods, energy efficient building methods. We also looked for zoning experts to present to us. For example, we reached out to Carol at MCAN, who was super helpful. And we also went to some USGBC events as well to sort of learn more about the state of the art. Over the course of the year, we also met several times with the city's planning department to advocate for passive house standards among a range of other things. We also encouraged our planning department to attend the municipal roundtable that Meredith mentioned, which I believe they did. But of course, we found that zoning is limited as a tool for pushing energy efficiency standards. There were some incentives that we think we can sort of get into the zoning code, and there were some accommodations for passive house buildings that could be built into the zoning, but the zoning itself couldn't mandate things because of the building code, as I think both Ben and Rebecca have mentioned. So that led us to join up with MCAN's advocacy on the building code late last year and into this year. And we've done a couple things on both elements of the campaign that Rebecca talked about. So regarding the base code update, we asked the city's Commission on Energy Use and Climate Change, which is in essence chaired by our sustainability director, to get involved with the IECC base code updates. And he's at first conservative in kind of setting expectations on how deeply the city would get involved. But when we checked back a month later, they ended up with a great response, and they ended up putting forward 5 different teams to get involved in the IECC base code update, including the mayor's office, the fire departments, 2 divisions of the planning department, and ISD, inspectional services. And I suspect that had to do with some counsel they got from MAPC as well. So it wasn't all due to certainly our advocacy. And separately in that process, we asked the city council to become a team in that voting process, which they did without hesitation, really. So Somerville has 6 teams in that process to define revisions to the base code, and they'll be hopefully pushing those energy efficiency points this fall in the voting process. On the stretch code advocacy with the BBRS, we first asked whether the sustainability department would be willing to testify before the BBRS in an open hearing back in May, and they did so at that meeting in conjunction with Cambridge and Boston. And again, I suspect that had more to do with MAPC's coordination than necessarily our advocacy, but I think it was important that they heard from us. Meanwhile, our city council has been interested in learning on an ongoing basis about different aspects of sustainability. So we arranged to have Somerville architects, the same Somerville architect with passive house expertise, present to the city council about passive house back on May 23rd. And the council was really engaged and turned what was supposed to be a 5-minute presentation into a 30-minute Q&A, which was great. And lastly, we asked our city council to write a letter to the BBRS in support of the net zero stretch code legislation, followed on with the letter that Ben referred to that our mayor had signed. And so the city council went ahead and approved a resolution just last week, just last Thursday, asking the BBRS to develop a net zero stretch code and also backing the stretch code legislation. So I think that brings us up to date for all the work that we've done on this in the past year and a half. And I also, of course, want to stress that it wasn't just me. There are a number of different individuals in our coalition who've been pretty active in this Better Buildings work.
Thank you, Larry. And I think right now brings us to our moderated Q&A. So just as a reminder, please take advantage of that chat window that's available to you. Post inside of there, and we're going to work our way through there. Also like to call back our presenters. So Meredith, Ben, Rebecca, and Larry to help answer some of the questions that have been coming in while we've been on here. Also a reminder for everyone, this webinar will be emailed out to everyone tomorrow. A link will be shared with you to, for you to be able to refer back to this or to share with you within your networks. So let's start here. So the first question we have here is from Rosemary, who asks, what's the likelihood of adopting zero energy of any category for existing buildings? And she says it seems like retrofit would be the most ecological choice over taking up sites and bringing in all new materials for new buildings. Meredith, I think you were talking about zero energy, so if you could want to answer this question about what's the likelihood of adopting zero energy for existing buildings.
Does that mean adopting a zero energy code or I
think this is referring to retrofits, which is something probably a little bit different from what we were talking about tonight, but we were getting a lot of retrofit questions that was coming up. So,
yeah, I mean, according to what Ben was saying earlier too, I mean, we're going to have to focus on existing buildings in order to meet to meet our climate goals. And so it's really important, and it is feasible. I mean, our study, if you saw I believe the example I showed was looking at existing buildings, that was existing commercial buildings, and that it's both feasible. There's a lot of things that we can do right off the bat in terms of efficiencies, and that when we're doing major renovations, we're able to bring those buildings and reduce those energy use intensities to the point then that we can look for whether we can put some renewables on the building or go off-site for the renewables. But it's definitely feasible, and any step in towards zero is a step in the right direction.
Great. Rebecca, we've got a question about building codes, and I think before we get into that, because we are getting a lot of questions about rehabbing, could you speak again about why we're starting with net zero or net zero energy for new buildings rather than jumping right into the rehabbing? Why that was chosen as a campaign plan?
Right. So I think something important to note that I could emphasize further is that the stretch code as well as our current base code apply to new construction only. So when we're talking about a net zero stretch code, we are talking about net zero for all new buildings. And we see this as just the tip of the iceberg to getting all of our buildings to net zero because, as Meredith said, we absolutely do need to do some major retrofits in order to make our existing buildings net zero. But I think that getting new buildings committed or starting to build new buildings net zero now is a really important step in the next direction because, like Ben mentioned, we are in a housing boom. A lot of new buildings are getting built, and if we do it the right way the first time, we won't have to go back and retrofit later.
Great. And Rebecca, while you're here, I just lost the question. Give me 1 second. Carolyn asked a question about, I'm trying to find this one back. Here we go. As a planning board member frustrated by how little we can do to require energy efficiency, do you recommend we testify at the BBRS hearing with their stories?
Yes, I would absolutely recommend that. So the next public comment opportunity the BBRS is having isn't actually until November, but we are encouraging municipal officials to write letters in the meantime to the BBRS, and I'd be more than happy to talk to you and your planning board about how to craft a letter unique to your community that you can then send to the BBRS. Okay.
And Rebecca, sticking along with that, two questions here that I think are related from Kathy. One is, did you say the new timeline for the new stretch code is coming in November, or is that just the vote?
So the vote on the IECC, which is the base code, will be happening in November. This next version of the IECC isn't actually going to go into effect until 2022. The next version of the stretch code will go into effect in 2021.
Okay, and again, how will those revised stretch codes impact existing buildings?
Right, so the current stretch code doesn't apply to existing buildings, but this is definitely a discussion thinking about things like gut rehabs. We want to make sure that these buildings that are being seriously renovated are being renovated to be net zero. And we want to think about other ways that we can make sure that we're addressing retrofits that the code may not allow for.
Okay. Thanks, Rebecca. Merritt, I think this one might be best for you, is if you could talk a little bit about the difference between net zero energy and net zero carbon. Or I'm sorry, net zero energy and zero carbon.
Yeah, and so I think I can see the question, and the question is, you know, absolutely we really want to be driving for zero carbon, which would mean that we're stop burning fossil fuels, that we don't want to be using fossil fuel energy and then just offsetting that with other energy. And so there's a big push now for complete electrification so that we can get there. And I think it's important with the code that right now, it's really in the early stages, and the initiative that's happening that MCAN is pushing is just saying, hey, require BBRS to have a net zero code, and then the details of what that's going to be will come next. But absolutely, the goal is to get to zero carbon, and we can't do that if we're offsetting and still burning fossil fuels.
Thank you, Meredith. Ben, I think this is a good question for you. It's about incorporating anticipated technological improvements and efficiencies for the expected life of the building. Have you, as Boston is starting to put together their plan going forward, how is that brought into building that plan as far as what's available now compared to what's available in the future?
Well, I think that's the problem with unknown future innovations, is you don't know what's coming down the pipe. The main focus has been on what technology do we know exists today, what best practices we know exist today, and how can we best put them into practice in such a way that lowers our emissions and meets all the other goals of the city of building equitable and affordable housing as well. And so the truth is, that's something we can hope to anticipate, but we can't entirely predict. And the focus now is on what can we do today to help meet our goals. But it's definitely something that we consider as very important, especially as we approach those harder to reach sort of emissions reduction targets of, as I mentioned before, the hospitals, the larger laboratories, and manufacturing facilities who have very particular and very important process loads that we need to find ways of new and innovative ways of displacing.
Okay. Ben, another question here for you. So this comes from Fred. He's asking about Boston's ability to achieve net zero. With electrification being a big part of that, is Boston looking at electric supply and making sure that the electric supply for the city and all the buildings in it are using clean energy?
Yes, and that's one of the main options that the BU study put forward as important, and I think we have made big steps in that direction with the recently passed and win process of developing the community choice aggregation program for Boston. That basically means that the city will help to aggregate the purchasing of electricity across all the electricity customers in such a way that we can help to surpass the state mandates for renewable energy and more aggressively move towards a larger chunk of electricity being from renewable sources. Though we can get into the weeds of that a little bit, but that's going to have a huge impact on our overall emissions. But there's going to be other areas of the electricity load that we can't immediately touch through community choice aggregation, municipal aggregation, and that's going to be the short end of it. Is that if you are a large office building and that you already have a contract with a power purchase agreement or any sort of electricity power agreement, then the city can't interfere with that, and so there's a lot good chunks of the city electricity load that we're not going to be able to immediately displace with this strategy, but it's a very important first step towards moving towards the 100% renewable grid that we know we need to achieve.
Thank you, Ben. And I think this is one last question here. I think this is going to be it for the night. Rebecca, we have a couple quick questions if you can answer on the stretch code. Which definition of net zero are we talking about when we refer to the net zero stretch code? And then with that, is the stretch code the same for all Massachusetts towns, or is it up to individual towns to adopt?
So we're talking about net zero carbon, which allows for the purchase of renewable energy off-site, since it isn't possible for all large buildings in Massachusetts to generate all of their energy on-site. And then the second question, sorry, can you repeat the second question, Drew?
Yep, so is the net zero stretch code apply to all towns, or is it up to individual towns to adopt?
Gotcha. Okay, so the stretch code is not mandatory, so it can be passed on a municipal level, but current towns that have passed the stretch code are required to adopt to the most recent stretch code when and if it gets updated. So there will definitely be a phase-in period for net zero, but ultimately the goal is for all stretch code communities to have passed a net zero code. And then super quickly before we sign off, I'm just going to answer our last question, asking if we can make some other resources that Larry mentioned available afterwards. So I can definitely send all of that out tomorrow, including things like a sample template letter from city officials, as well as other materials that we've been using.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca, and thank you for answering that last question. So thank you to our speakers tonight, Meredith Elbaum from USGBC, Ben Silverman from the City of Boston, Larry Yu with the Climate Coalition of Somerville, and Rebecca Winterick-Knox from MCAN. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Please look forward to your email tomorrow for a link to this webinar and share it amongst your friends, colleagues, and associates. But thank you all for joining tonight, and we look forward to you joining our next Net Zero webinar coming up in a few weeks. Stay tuned for that. Thank you, and have a good night.